We're here with a man who I think has more stories to tell about the blues in the 20th century than anyone else you're likely to meet at the Blues Festival this weekend. My guest is Dick Waterman, one of the legendary figures in the music business from the mid and later 20th century. To tell his story means talking about the 1960s and what an important decade it was in blues history. This was the era that came to be known as the Blues Revival, a time when many older blues musicians of the early 20th century who had recorded a song or two or three back in the 20s and 30s in the early era of commercial sound recording had disappeared and gone off the radar screen of the music business. And in the 1960s, a lot of young people, mostly in the Northeast, people like Dick Waterman became newly interested in this music and sought out some of those older musicians from before World War II and brought them back into the limelight and revitalized their careers. And so to talk about Dick Waterman's life in the blues is to talk about so many famous musicians whose names any blues lover knows, names like Son House, Mississippi John Hurt, Skip James, Junior Wells, and the list goes on and on and on. He didn't serve as a musician playing with those people, but rather served as a manager, a promoter, a booker, a friend, and a supporter of many of those artists. And his role was so significant in doing so that he was one of the first non-performers to be inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame in 2000. To help summarize a little bit of what an important role he played in that era, I want to quote from Bonnie Raitt, who was one of the many musicians he worked with later in his career as an agent. She wrote the introduction to a book by Mr. Waterman called Between Midnight and Day. And here's what she said about his role in the 60s in the Blues Revival in serving as a manager and agent for these famous pre-war bluesmen. She said, "By gathering so many great artists under one roof, Dick was able to collectively bargain to ensure each artist got to play the best gigs and to be paid what they deserved. He steadfastly guarded every aspect of his artist's professional life and was often their family's solid rock during personal crises as well. By helping to raise the quality of life for so many artists with whom he worked, by reminding the white progeny of these mighty scions wherein their debt lies, by refusing to compromise, probably at the expense of his own advancement, and by taking the high road and loving the people as well as the music, Dick Waterman has helped shepherd the blues to a place in history truly benefiting its worth." Please help me welcome a legend of the music business, Dick Waterman.
Thank you. I always like to say that people know me from different periods in my life. That in 1962, 3, 4, I was out looking for older bluesmen. And two other fellows and I, we went tracking Son House. And we found him living in Rochester, New York, by way of going through the Mississippi Delta. So I worked with old bluesmen, 64, 5, 6. Then I had several of them die off. Managing people that are in their 70s has a dim future. They die. So Bob Kester of Delmark Records told me that he was releasing an album of a guy who really wanted to go out on the road, and that was Junior Wells. Junior was the first Chicago band that I worked with, starting in '66. The next year I added Buddy Guy, and then Otis Rush, and then Luther Allison. And by that time, in 1968, I had met Bonnie Raitt, who was a freshman in college in Boston, and she wanted to have a music career. So I worked with Bonnie up until the early 70s, and then I started promoting shows with, I did a lot of Springsteen shows, and Bonnie Raitt and Randy Newman and Cat Stevens and James Taylor, and I did all of that. Then I moved from the West Coast to Oxford, Mississippi in 1986, and I've been there now 30 years. I really, at some point in the late 80s, started to go back to my photography, that I always carried a camera with me in the 60s with my old bluesmen. So there's been a continuing interest in them. Two acts that I photographed in the 60s that are still busy now, it's phenomenal, my legacy, the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan. 50 years with them, and they're still out there doing it. So I've been doing photo exhibits and things like that ever since. That kind of sums it up.
I think that doesn't even begin to sum it up. Let's start with the fact that you just mentioned casually that you were part of the group that helped rediscover Son House. After he had left the music world, he had recorded a few sides in I guess, the 30s, and then maybe with Lomax. But then what was he doing in Rochester, New York, when you and your friends tracked him down?
He had worked for the New York Central and then retired. And, I came in and I said, there could be a future here. You could come back to playing. So Mrs. House was down on the idea. He's lazy, he's not going to do anything, whatever. And I said, but there might be money. And that got everybody's attention. So, okay, let's go see. So in those days, 64, 5, we toured, and we didn't track triple figures for money, $50 a night, $75 a night, till finally we got $125 from Wayne State University in Detroit, and we said, what fools they are. But anyway, so I'll tell you a brief story. There were so many bluesmen out there, Son House, Skip James, John Hurt, Fred McDowell, Big Boy Crudup, Lightning Hopkins, Mance Lipscomb, on. And the pool of money wasn't too big. So you had a lot of bluesmen going for a relatively small amount of money. And I said, someday there will only be a few bluesmen, and they will be able to make a real living at this. So as they all died off, the survivors were Honey Boy Edwards, Pinetop Perkins, Robert Lockwood, Henry Gray, Henry, of course we know Henry.
Still with us.
And so those guys should make a real living. $500 an airfare, $1,000 at a festival. So it was true, you could make a real living. And I'm going to parse this carefully. It doesn't mean that they were the greatest musicians. They had the genes to live the longest. If I lived in the world of Son House and Skip James and Fred McDowell, then the musicians that were on in the year 2000 and beyond sort of pale by comparison. And at this point, I want to tell you about two documentary films, my highest recommendations to both. There's a film on Fred McDowell called Shake 'Em On Down, one of his songs. And they get Buddy Guy in it and Bonnie Raitt, and it's really great. If you ever listen to Fred, he was like outgoing and friendly, and he just made friends. And this is captured in this film. It's called Shake 'Em On Down. The other one is a really magnificent piece of filmmaking. Son House and Skip James were recorded at the same time. They each made an odd number of sides, and the odd Skip James and the odd Son House were put together on one record, which has never been found. They were rediscovered on the same day. 3 guys came from California to Mississippi. 3 guys came from New England into Mississippi. And on the same day of the same month, they found Son House and Skip James. That was the time of voter registration and civil rights unrest. On the day that Son was found and Skip was found, the three civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, were murdered on that day, the same day, June 21, 1964. And they have taken this story, the movie is called Two Trains Running, and it's out playing the festival circuit now, but it definitely will find a commercial distribution. It's an amazing film. It's really, really well done. They animated where they didn't have film. So Phil and Nick Prills and I are animated. So they had one photo of me from '64, and they animated it. It's really trippy to look at yourself in animation. Anyway, so I found them. Now, Son had not played in years, and he had a severe drinking problem. So to play, he had to have something to drink. But too much to drink took him over into being unable to play. So it was a tricky balance that we had to maintain. But when he had it right, he was the greatest. There's never been such emotion. I say, if you want to know how good Son House was, don't look at Son House. Look at the face of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Jimmy Reed when they watched Son House. When Son died, Buddy Guy said, that man was just playing another kind of music. He brought it from a place so emotional that he closed his eyes rolled back, and the sweat broke out, and he went back to someplace in time. He went back to Greenwood or Greenville or Clarksdale or 1930 or 1940. He just took himself somewhere else. And the songs went on as long as he felt like playing. 5 minutes, 9 minutes, 15 minutes. And then when he played, he would drop back in his chair and take a handkerchief out and mop his face. And then he was way off the microphone because he sat back in the chair. And then he said, well, that was just a little piece of blues. I hope you like it. And then he would tell a story, and the story always showed him to be the fool, the buffoon, the clown, self-deprecating songs. And then he would introduce the next song, and he would reach in his pocket for his slide, put it on his finger, pop, pop, lay the slide down on the end of the neck, and just take a few breaths, and then rip that slide up the neck, and go on, and he would sit up straight and be right on the mic. And the songs would go, as I said, any length that he wanted them to make them. And then he ended the song and sat back in the chair. And they were all mini masterpieces that he made one album for Columbia in '65. And then in 1990, they went back in and did alternate takes and some more material.
You actually connected him to Columbia Records. Were you the one who connected Son House to Columbia Records, to John Hammond?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyway, so by the time we got to the middle of 1974, just a decade, from '64 to '74, he started being forgetful on stage. He would finish a song and then look at me, and I knew he didn't remember what song he had just played. And he would backhand across the strings to see what tuning he was in. And then he would look at me, and so I went to Mrs. House and I said, look, I think we should wrap it up. You know, he's got some money. He has a legacy of a couple of good albums. And the recordings from Newport Folk Festival, I think we should wrap it up here. So it was okay with her, because it was never her idea to do it, so it was never her idea to stop it. He would just be around the house more. But what I didn't anticipate is that people with a tape recorder and a couple of bottles of wine would come by the house. So we now have 2 or 3, like Sun House at Home, Sun House Live in Rochester, and these are really sadly pathetic albums. And it was something that I couldn't have stopped anyway, that he was findable, and they were going to find him and record him. So I always say there's 3 or 4 albums that are really good. There's the Newport recording, which is very good. The 2-disc CD on Columbia, which is now called Sony. And there's a really wonderful set from the Cafe Au Go-Go in New York City. Beyond that, there's a lot of highs and lows.
Can you take us back to the revival scene in the Northeast, to the world of Cambridge and to the world of Newport in 1964, 1965?
Right.
Well, I mean, we hear about the folk revival and we hear about blues entering in. Did people make much of a distinction at that time?
At Newport, you could make a career. One appearance, 15 minutes, 4 or 5 songs, you could make a career. The record company was in the Backstage area. John Hammond from Columbia, Jack Holtzman from Elektra, Maynard Solomon from Vanguard, Chris Stockwitz from Ahuli. They were all in the Backstage area. You did your 15 minutes, 3, 4 songs, you came down, and at the bottom of the stairs, somebody was waiting. And they say, "Hi, can I talk to you for a minute?" I said, "Yeah." It was as fragmented as that a great 15 minutes could make your career. And we had a couple offers for Sun, but in the mid-'60s, Columbia was the biggest, most widely distributed and oldest record label on the planet. So the idea of having a Sun House album on Columbia, I liked the guys who did Ahuli and Delmark and all those labels, but this was for his career. So we made an album for Columbia called Father of the Folk Blues. What had happened was Robert Johnson dead in 1938, but John Hammond went into the archives and took a Robert Johnson album, which came in '62. And it was an immediate hit with blues fans. I must have bought easily 10 of them, that you bring somebody over to your house and you play the Robert Johnson and you say, "Well, take mine, I'll get another one tomorrow." And I must have given out 10 or 15 albums because it was that good. It was so much better than everybody else. Anyway, that Sun was really, really quite different. There were Delta singers. Muddy, of course, was from the Delta, but Muddy had left the Delta as a young man. There really was no one like Sun out there. He was raw and he was emotional.
Yeah. Of all of the people you've worked with from that era, Sun House, Mississippi John Hurt, Skip James, Lightning Hopkins, for us in Louisiana, one of the names really pops out, and that's Robert Pete Williams. To many people in the rest of the country, maybe not quite as well known, but can you remind us about how Robert Pete came to be known and then what role you played?
I'm not sure if managing is quite the term with Robert, because they weren't beating the doors down to get him into festivals. Newport, 1964, was probably the greatest gathering of country blues artists. Sun House, Skip James, John Hurt, Lightning Hopkins, Vance Lipscomb, Fred McDowell, piano players, Roosevelt Sykes, little brother Montgomery. Newport 64 really belonged to Skip. He had recorded once in 1930, and 31, and then vanished. What did he do for 33 years? Nobody knew. Could have been a preacher, could have worked on the railroad, nothing. Absolutely nothing would be known. So they found him and they brought him to Newport 64. And he came on stage and he was a borrowed guitar. And those of us who really were into country blues said, this man from 33 years is going to step out of the ozone. He was just going to be there. He was going to play a real human being, Skip James, after 33 years. And I was enough into my photography that I said, I want this song. I want this verse. I want this first note. I want this first note. And I brought my camera up, and he hit the strings, and he raised his head, and it clicked. The photo's in the book. And he's saying, I'd rather be the devil than to be that woman's man. And he did probably, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And the audience, it was outside, it was like he sucked the air out of the room. Everybody, he just cast a spell. He was being managed by real incompetence, really people that didn't know what they were doing. So he went from 64 to 65, Newport, a full year without an album, without being recorded, without anything. He had such a buzz from 64 that he was just spellbinding, but they kind of lost it, they kind of dropped it. So he came to me in 65, and Skippy, he talked like this, and he talked about himself. Now Skippy, he said to me, Mr. Waterman, I see that Son House, he has an album out, and he plays festivals. Yes. He said, now Skippy should be doing those things. He said, Skippy wants you to be his manager. Now, I said, okay. But now the buzz had been gone from Newport 64. But if you want to have a CD, a great cross-section of the blues, Mary Catherine Alden produced Blues at Newport, which is mostly 64, 65, and it's a great buy. It's got Blues at Newport. And I forget, Robert Pete, of course, was at Newport 64. And I walked up, and he was sitting down in the sun, wearing a wool suit, with a dress shirt and a tie, and a little straw hat, a little pork pie hat. And so I walked up to him and I tapped him. I said, Mr. Williams, my name is Dick Waterman, and it's a pleasure to meet you. I later found out that I was the first white man to call him Mr. Williams. So he had been found because there was a recording by Dr. Harry Oster, recorded 3 bluesmen in Angola, Robert Pete Williams, Hogman Maxey, and Guitar Welch. So I, being incredibly stupid, I said, and Mr. Maxey and Mr. Welch, how are they? And he looked at me and he said, they still there. They were still in Angola. They're still there. And he played probably 4 or 5 songs, and it's on this Blues at Newport. And Robert, taken as a person, was just an innocent. There's a word called a naif, N-A-I-F, a naif. It's just a person completely clueless, just traveling through life, not knowing anyone or having strong feelings. And Raitt was like that. He was just a lovely man. And he did 7 years in Angola, and as he tells the story, his wife was going to a movie. So he went to a bar next door and was sitting at a table when a man came in very drunk, pulled a gun and mistaken Raitt for someone else, and walked towards Raitt with his gun out. So Raitt, in one of the great lines of understatement, says, "I give him the first shot, Mr. Richard, and then I had to burn the man." I don't know. I wouldn't give anyone the first shot. Raitt gave him the first shot and then killed the man. And he was just another man going into jail for life. Harry Oster was a professor of English at LSU. And he recorded Raitt, and the album came out. And off of that, Raitt was given his release. He was given parole, but not a pardon. Yep. And which is really, if you look at it, they're quite different. So anyway, Raitt was let out to go to Newport. They gave him a suit of clothes and a borrowed guitar, and he rode by bus from western Louisiana to Newport, Rhode Island, with the stipulation that he had to be on the bus heading back to Louisiana less than 24 hours after he finished his music in Rhode Island. And he did. He was just a really nice man. You knew, if provoked, he had a violent side. But if you left him alone, he was just a quiet, nice man, lovely wife, lots of children, and very respectful.
I wish we could talk all day to Dick Waterman. I want to turn it over to you in the audience in case anybody has any questions. Yes.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Michael.
A story where Robert Pete was sitting at the bottom of the stairs. I'm not sure if it was in your house, and you heard him playing.
Oh, when he was playing in the morning?
Well, could you tell the story about when you came across him and he was playing by himself?
Right. Raitt stayed with me. I had a one-bedroom apartment in Philadelphia, and so Raitt slept on mattresses in the living room and a bathroom and a little kitchen. That was it. So I stayed up very late and slept very late. So I woke up pretty early, 9:30, and I could hear someone playing music. So I figured Raitt had figured out the phonograph. Back to sleep, and then I woke up and I heard music. Well, okay, I got up, and I went out into the one room, the living room, and no one was there. So I listened, and the music was coming down the stairwell. I looked down, and Raitt was sitting down at the bottom of the stairwell, playing gently and whispering, murmuring lyrics. And the stairwell kind of magnified the sound, amplified the sound coming up into the room. So I took out my camera and I took a picture, which is also in the book. And I photographed Raitt from the back, looking down on him in the stairwell. And he jumped up. He said, "Oh, I made too much noise, Mr. Richard. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you up." I said, "Well, I should have been up before now anyway." I said, "That was beautiful, Raitt. What was that song?" He said, "That wasn't no kind of song. I just put my words in the air, and they'd come down with Hattie Mae, that was his wife, in Rosedale. So I said, well, that's really beautiful. He said, I put my words in the air, and I say, I want you to be well, go to church, make sure them children behave and do their homework. And I want them to, I come home, I got one more play, and then I start for home tomorrow. I'm here with Mr. Richard. And he said, I said, that's so beautiful, Robert. You should play that music tonight. People would really like that. And he said, no. People want to buck dance and jump and swing. They don't want to hear that. That's just me talking to Hattie Mae. I said, you should try it, Robert. Play a soft song like that. That's really part of the blues. He said, no, people, they pay their money. They want to get up and dance and play that kind of music. And I could not convince him that what he was just whispering to his wife could be recorded, could be music that he would do. But he never would play it. He was just talking to his wife.
And how much longer did he live? Do you know how much longer he lived after that?
He died on New Year's Eve, I remember that. Maybe 81, 82.
When was that story, though?
I was managing Bonnie Raitt at the time. I managed Bonnie for about 20 years. And she was just coming around, and she was playing a concert in Baton Rouge. So I told her that I was going to go see Robert, who was at the hospital.
Yeah.
One of them Long brothers.
Yeah, Earl K. Long Hospital.
Which one?
Earl K. Long Hospital.
Okay. So I knew Robert knew he was dying of cancer. So I went in there, and I said, I'm here to see Mr. Williams, Robert Williams. And they did the 3x5 card. Got no too many Robert Williams. So I said he was dying of cancer. So she went to another box. She said he's on the 3rd floor. So I went up to the 3rd floor, and I walked around a big circle, and one of the room cards said, R. Williams. And I peeked in, and Robert was in there. And he was so black. It was just, his skin tone was so black. And he was in a white hospital shroud on a white sheet. And he just scared me because he was so thin. He had a big, heavy, muscular man, and he was so thin, dying of cancer. And I walked up, and I stood next to the bed, and he was sleeping. So I stepped back, and I hit one of the trays, which were on a metal stand, and it scraped. And I looked back, and he opened his eyes, and he said, Mr. Richard, that you? I said, yes, Robert. He said, you here for real? I said, yeah, Robert. Miss Bonnie, she's playing a show in town. So he was quiet for a second. He said, you tell Miss Bonnie that Robert, he sent her a hello. I said, I'll do that. He said, Mr. Richard, this cancer done ate me up so bad. And we talked for a little while, and he was drifting back into sleep. And if you're poor and black, they're not too generous with the pain medication. They just leave you alone. So I waited until he was sleeping, and then I backed out of the room. And I knew the next time I came down would be for his funeral, and it was.
I'd like to thank Dick Waterman for visiting us and sharing these stories that are so powerful and speak to the long legacy of not just blues music in the country, but blues music right here close to home in Baton Rouge. Unfortunately, our time is up, but let's give a round of applause to Dick Waterman.
Thank you. You know that I sort of retired to my photography, but last year I realized there's a blues man singing the old style, a guy named Jimmy Duck Holmes. He's from Bentonia and has the Blue Front Cafe. Michael, wearing the Blue Front Cafe shirt, takes care of Jimmy and takes care of the booking and things like that. But the Bentonia style is Skip James, who was from Bentonia. So it is so eerie to hear a geographically rooted musical style that other people may play at Skip or do what he's doing, but they're not really playing Skip. But Jimmy Holmes, Duck Holmes, when he touches the strings, it's Skip James incarnate. I cannot phrase it any more than that. So for those of us who knew Skip or worked with Skip, it's just uncanny that he has several albums out. Michael just issued his new CD. He's 68 and out playing the festival circuit. So if you get a chance to see Jimmy Duck Holmes, he is so much the real thing. I want to say that.
Thank you.
Can I mention 2 films? Did I mention the 2 films?
You mentioned one.
Okay. There's one film about Fred McDowell called Shake 'Em On Down, which was one of his songs. The other one is called Two Trains Running, and it's about the weirdness of coincidence. Sun House in Rochester, New York, Skip James in Tunica, Mississippi, were refound after 30 years' absence on the same day. And the 3 civil rights workers, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, were murdered on that day. So the film weaves the story of the civil rights workers, the search for Sun, the search for Skip, and it all comes together on June 21, 1964. And the film is just really, really well done, that it will ultimately find some home on public television. But it's called Two Trains Running.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.